Hello everyone, my name is Cole and welcome to the 7th episode of How to Design Levels for Video Games. Last time we explored the design and layout stage of level design and learned how we can create stuff like bubble diagrams, rough layouts, and detailed maps, and we also discussed how we can plan to workshop different ideas into our levels. In this episode, we're going to move forward with the testing and revisions phase of level design, where we'll get to see how we can playtest our levels, discover design flaws that exist within them, and fix them up to prepare them for implementation into the game. This process is unique compared to the other steps because it's usually a recurring process that repeats itself numerous times. You'll continue to create new iterations of your level and scrap old ideas before you eventually settle on the version that you'll actually use in the game. So with that, let's begin by looking at playable prototypes. So in order to test out your level, you'll need to get an early playable version whipped up. Having everything set up in a playable form makes it a lot easier to fix up your level. Playable prototypes support experimentation and trial and error, as you can rapidly implement, test, and iterate on your ideas in one space. Your primary objective is to improve the foundational design of your level before you add polished art assets in its place. There's a very easy and common way of doing this. Like I mentioned back in episode 2, lots of game engines include simple features such as primitive game objects and basic player controllers. Creating a playable prototype of a level using these tools is commonly referred to as a blockout, or alternatively as a block mesh or a white box. The reason why blockouts are so useful is because they aren't wasteful. When you need to make changes to your level, it won't set you far back to edit simple shapes and geometry, compared to if you were working with finished art assets. There are many options available to designers for creating blockout prototypes. The most basic option is to use primitives. These are simple shapes such as cubes and spheres that you can arrange together to create a prototype. This option is very universal because primitives are a common staple of both 3D and 2D engines. The main downside here is that you'll end up with a prototype that's very short on detail. This is where our second option, modeling, comes in. With this option, you can model your own low-poly shapes to use for the blockout, which allows for more control over the way it will look, and allow for greater levels of detail. Lastly, there's sculpting, which involves deforming flat objects and planes to create smooth, realistic landscapes for your level. This is the best option if you're creating levels that feature large, natural environments, especially open-world games. When I began creating my level in Super Dungeon Maker, I started by doing an exact one-to-one recreation of my detailed map, room by room, so that it followed the sizing of everything to a T. Then I started expanding on it a little, making light changes here and there, and filling in the space with proper puzzles, mechanics, and challenges. The first iteration of my dungeon ended up looking like this. So once you're ready, hop into whatever engine or level design tool you're using and start setting up your prototype. While you're creating the prototype, make sure that you play the level and take note of how it feels to actually play it. At this point, playtesting is going to be your top priority. Seriously, playtest, and playtest some more. Aside from doing it yourself, you should get other people on your team to playtest, and of course, recruit dedicated playtesters to try it out for you as well. If you've got lots of playtesters, you'll get lots of feedback, and they'll have plenty of data to go off of to iterate and fix up the level. Ideally, there should be several playtest sessions that are hosted over the course of a game's development. Each time that you host a new one, you should have a new iteration of your level that addresses criticisms from the previous version. Basically, your process is going to look something like this. Block out the level, playtest, gather feedback, iterate on the level, and then repeat steps 2 through 4. During your playtest sessions, you should keep track of each playtester's experience with the level and analyze how they play it. You'll get to learn a lot about your level's design, flow, metrics, and gameplay, and discover whether or not they'll need any major adjustment. Simply put, this is the point where you'll see whether or not the ideas you had for your level actually work the way you intended. A lot of the time, the results can be surprising because an idea that you thought was absolutely incredible ends up getting a lot of criticism from playtesters. Case in point, For my Super Dungeon Maker level, upon playtesting and then receiving feedback from other people, I became aware of a ton of huge issues with its design that never once registered to me earlier. Later in this video, I'll be going over them. A few examples of things that you should analyze during your playtest sessions include: what kind of flow does the level have? We discussed in episode 3 that the flow of your level often ends up being very different than what you envisioned once you actually start playtesting. If it is, then what style of movement would be necessary for a flow like this? What changes would you need to make to the design in order to accommodate it? Is the environment too big or too small? More importantly, is the spacing of everything well executed? For many designers, getting the scale of the level just right is the hardest part. Are the playtesters able to navigate the level easily and stick to the golden path, or do they often get lost and confused? Are the playtesters able to pick up on mechanics that are being taught in the level, or do they often have trouble understanding how they work? Do they die or fail the level too frequently? Or maybe too little? Is this what you were planning, or was it unintentional? Do the playtesters ever get stuck with no way forward? Do the playtesters understand the visual hierarchy of the level? Is your level confusing for them to look at? Do they end up missing important details? Do the playtesters appear satisfied or underwhelmed by the gameplay of the level? You might have noticed that these are all things related to the principles of level design that we talked about back in episode 3. When you're trying to make iterations and revisions to your level, the principles you're following should be used as a baseline to help you figure out how you can improve your level's design. Use them to discover flaws that exist within your level, and then refer to them to determine fixes for these flaws. With my level, once I finished up the first iteration and found all of the big problems with it, I used each of the 12 principles to think of solutions. Here's what I came up with. While I was testing the dungeon, I found that its flow ended up being very different from what I was planning it to be. My original intention was for it to be radically non-linear and have a generally slow pace. However, as I was creating it, I found that it followed a sort of prescribed non-linearity, meaning that although the dungeon does feature a lot of branching paths, there's really only one set path that the player can follow, and there aren't many instances where the player can complete objectives in any order. It also had a much snappier pace to it than I was imagining it would have. While making revisions to the dungeon, I focused on deliberately designing it around this particular flow. One bit of feedback that I received was that the level didn't do a good job of introducing locked doors, which serve as gates for progressing through the level. The player finds the first key in the second room of the dungeon. However, there's one issue here. The player doesn't necessarily know that they're looking for a key. My intention was to have the player find the key and then use it on a locked door, but it's actually possible that they could move through 3 entire rooms before finding the door to use it on. With this being the first instance of the keys and locks in the dungeon, I should establish the goal of unlocking the door before having the player find the key. As a solution, I redesigned the second room and added a locked door. In this version, the player first makes their way towards the locked door, realizes that they can't move forward without a key, and then searches for the key in the room. This creates a very self-contained goal that allows the player to clearly understand how to overcome gated progress. The wind-up trigger mechanic that I use in this dungeon is taught poorly since it doesn't follow the process of Teach Test Challenge. The very first time that the player engages with it is in Room 8, and it involves a puzzle that's very frame-specific and hard to pull off, which isn't helped by the added challenge of the enemies and the fireballs that get shot at the player from the corners of the room. Meanwhile, the second instance where the player engages with the mechanic features no noticeable increase in challenge, and in some ways is actually a little bit easier. To fix this, I simplified Room 8's design to give the player a bit more margin for error, and I created a third and final instance of the mechanic found near the end of the dungeon, in Room 25, that's much more challenging to pull off than the other two. So with that, the mechanic is taught to the player in a straightforward way before it begins ramping up the complexity. In the dungeon, many of the combat encounters were poorly balanced, especially early on when the player hasn't unlocked the shield yet. The very first combat encounter that the player engages with has them battling 2 forkers, who are among the toughest standard enemies in the game. In general, it feels like the combat encounters in the dungeon have a lot of random difficulty spikes instead of a natural curve as the player gets further along. In order to fix this, I reviewed the critical path that I had laid out for the player, and I placed weaker enemies near the beginning and harder enemies near the end. This created a more balanced and gradual increase in challenge. I found that several of the rooms of my dungeon were either too small or were trying to cram too much stuff in them. The biggest offender was room 11, the room after the player unlocks the hookshot. It leaves very little room for the player to line up their shots, and I found myself falling off the ledge a lot. This made the experience of trying out a new mechanic, which should be very fun, instead very frustrating. As such, I increased the size of these rooms, or simplified them, by removing unnecessary elements, which made them a lot less crowded. In room 17, I found that the psych laser enemies were very frustrating because they could easily snipe the player from across the room, making moving around unnecessarily annoying. As a solution, I added 4 pillars that the player could shield themselves with and use to time their movements accordingly, creating safe zones. I also added these pillars to the final boss room, adding an extra element of strategy that was missing before. There was one thing that bothered me about the original version of the dungeon, and that was how the player earned the shield. It's given to the player in room 9 as an optional reward. However, it doesn't really feel like the player earns it due to the way that it's just sitting out in the open clear as day. Considering the fact that it's meant to be a reward, I felt it should be something that the player has to work for, so I moved it into the central hub room as a reward for defeating all of the enemies in the room. Generally speaking, there were plenty of ways that the rooms of the dungeon looped back on each other, but it felt like it was lacking in shortcuts that the player could open up as they made progress. In room 14, I set up a wall of blocks that the player could destroy by activating the lever so they could create a shortcut. I liked this concept and thought I should try to apply it to other rooms. I included them in rooms 21 and 23 to create quicker ways to backtrack to earlier parts of the dungeon. In regards to signposting, I decided that the best ways to guide the player were to use braziers to lead them towards doors, and alternating red and blue bollards as a way to help keep them on the right path. For example, when the player enters the central room for the first time, the raised blue bollards prevent the player from heading to the north side of the room, so they're locked into exploring either the east or west wing. I decided to expand on this mechanic a lot while revising my dungeon's design. For example, many doors are blocked by active bollards, so the player knows that whichever color is currently inactive will lead in the right direction. In room 15 of the dungeon, there's a bombable wall that the player must blow open in order to create a loop that allows them to solve the puzzle involving the red bollards that are blocking their way forward. Obviously, this is a very important thing to make note of, but due to the lighting and orientation of the room, it's barely visible. A solution that I came up with was to put 2 braziers on either side of the wall to highlight it. And I also placed the bird statue that the player needs to move right in front of it. This way, when the player moves the statue, their attention will already be directed at that corner of the room, and the wall will be more visible. In a number of rooms, there are instances of leaps of faith. For example, in room 6, the player enters the room and gets ambushed by blade traps. Due to the way that the game works, you can't see anything in the room until you enter it, so it becomes impossible for the player to predict these threats and very hard for them to avoid getting hit. To fix this, I moved these threats farther back from the door so that the player has an opportunity to anticipate them. Though most of the dungeon was fully playable, there was actually a pretty significant softlock that I discovered. In the central room, there's a locked door at the north side of the room. Players could use one of the keys they obtained in the east wing of the dungeon on this door, leaving them with no keys to use in the west wing and rendering the dungeon unbeatable. My solution was to move the locked door in room 12 to the north side of the room, where it's used to enter the mini-boss room. This way the dungeon uses the same amount of keys and locked doors, but it becomes impossible to trap yourself since the order of locked doors is changed. So as you can see, by frequently playtesting and gathering feedback, and by looking at your levels through the lens of these different design principles, you can easily find lots of things that can be improved about them. As you keep making revisions to your level design, you'll continue to improve it, and eventually it'll reach a state where you and your team are satisfied with it. Once you get to that point, the actual design of the level is all done, and you can move on to polishing it up and making it look nice and complete. That's exactly what we will be exploring next time in the final episode of the series. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.